everyone. Welcome to the April 4th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski as we look back at last week's racing from around the country, obviously focusing mostly on Gulfstream Park and Oaklawn Park, where they ran two major final round Kentucky Derby prep races, the Grade 1 Florida Derby at Gulfstream and the Grade 1 Arkansas Derby at Oaklawn, both of those offering 100 points to the winner and basically solidifying spots in the starting gate for the winners, though I think the winners of each race already had their spot in the starting gate guaranteed as far as the points go. But we did get some clarity as far as some other horses that did well in those races that probably earned spots in the Kentucky Derby starting gate. So we'll talk about those races, everything that was going on around trips, timing, and also the undercard of both of those Arkansas Derby and Florida Derby cards. Plenty of other graded stakes action at Gulfstream, some other stakes action including Oaks preps on the undercards also at Oaklawn Park, where we might have seen the Kentucky Oaks favorite. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Then we'll move on to some other venues. There was some stakes racing at Santa Anita that we want to discuss on the turf. There was a big speed figure registered at Aqueduct on Saturday, and also one race at Laurel that some people might have missed that actually got a pretty nice number for a 3-year-old, but we'll get to that at the end of the podcast. Craig, let's begin with those Derby preps, and we'll start at Gulfstream Park with that Florida Derby, and a lot to discuss in this race, but I mean, let's start with the winner, Forte. What did you make of his performance?
Thought it was good. He's just the kind of horse that I think's never really going to blow you away. He just has that kind of grinding style. He got the job done, and I think what's being overlooked is in the end how easily he actually won. And once he got going and got in the full gear, he just kind of ran by the runner-up Mage, who ran a good race in his own right. Some might even argue a better race, but I have no knocks on Forte. I thought he ran fine. I don't think you want to leave it all on the table in your last start. So it would seem like, before the Kentucky Derby. So it would seem like he's moving in the right direction. I guess there's a small concern that speed figure wise, he really hasn't taken a step forward from his 2-year-old season. He got just a 1:16 for this race, and I'm sure we'll talk about the timing a little bit. But that 1:16 is based on a time that's rock solid. So yeah, it's a figure that's good. He's going to be the Derby favorite. I don't know if it's one that blows me away.
Yeah, I agree with most of that, Craig. As you mentioned, there was that timing issue in this race, primarily in the final eighth of a mile. The beam just got tripped a little bit early, so what was originally registering as, I think, a 12-1 or just over 12 flat final eighth really is more like a 13 final eighth. So I saw a lot of chatter about Forte coming home extremely fast, maybe 11 and change based on the original times. That's kind of what tipped me off that there might have been a timing issue in this race, and that's all been worked out and corrected. And as Craig said, speed figures, TimeformUS, buy, or whatever you're using, they're based on the corrected time now. And I think you have to be a little bit concerned, if you're concerned about anything with Forte, that he just hasn't taken that speed figure step forward from his 2-year-old season. He was earning some really nice numbers at the end of last year in the Breeders' Futurity and the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. But his 2 numbers this year, while they're solid enough, and the 1:16 is just a slight regression from his Fountain of Youth, you do have to worry about that slight step backwards and the fact that he really hasn't improved on the speed figures that he was earning at the end of last year. So I do wonder a little bit if he's just one of these precocious horses that peaked a little bit early. And Craig, I also want to comment a little bit on some of the discussion that I see happening around the trips in this race. It feels to me like people almost predetermined that Forte was going to get a bad trip just because he drew post 11, and they were sort of retrofitting that opinion to what they actually saw afterwards. I've got to say, I thought Irad Ortiz gave Forte a great ride. I mean, he was never as wide as he could have been from that outside draw. Got him into about the 3 or 4 path into the clubhouse turn. I mean, he proceeded in the 3 path for most of his trip, but I thought Irad made the right decision coming around the far turn, not getting suckered into making that early move when Mage made that premature bid outside of him. He waited, tipped out when they got into the stretch so he didn't lose additional ground, and Forte mowed them down at the end, but this was a race that featured a pretty fast pace. If you look in the TimeformUS chart, a couple of those fractions are color-coded in red, some pace figures in the 140s for the leader in the early stages. So this was a race that was falling apart towards the end, and I thought that Irad made all the right moves from that post position.
I totally agree. I didn't see a bad trip at all for Forte. If there was a bad trip, it was Mage who actually got first run. And I do want to say I did confirm with one of the owners. It's pronounced Mage. I've heard Madge, I've heard Maggie, I've heard McGee. So it's Mage. So we'll go with that from now on. And you were saying it right. Just I've heard so many different ways it's said out there for four letters. But yeah, Forte's trip was fine. I thought Irad gave a great ride. He actually saved ground as much as he could most of the way. I don't think if we were using Trackus numbers, if they were still around, that it would be any kind of crazy number for him. And yeah, he just ran okay. Mage, I'm not sure what to do with him. He's gotten out of the gate a little slow two times in a row. He's obviously a horse that has some talent. He's going to be good enough to get into points wise to get in the Kentucky Derby. I never am a big fan of horses, especially after last year when at the last minute I wavered and went with Taiba, and I just told myself never again because it's just so hard for these lately raced horses to run in that 20 horse field, especially when they don't get out of the gate very well.
Yeah, and it's now been twice in a row that Mage has broken slowly. He did the same thing in the Fountain of Youth when he had to rush up. That's the reason that he was not on the lead in that race. And this time, I mean, when you're breaking badly from an inside post position, you're going to get shuffled back the way that he was. And he ended up last going into that clubhouse turn. And I mean, I think Luis Saez did what you kind of had to do when you're dealt that bad hand. He made that bid to get back into contention on the far turn, basically going from last to first around that turn. But he paid the price at the very end as Forte got the more patient ride and had a little bit left in the tank in that final eighth of a mile to mow him down. But there's an argument that Mage ran the better race. I just wonder if he's going to be able to turn the tables, as you were saying, on a horse like Forte in the Kentucky Derby, because you don't want to break slowly in a 20 horse field like he's been doing, and Forte just has more of that experience and seasoning. The issue with Forte, Craig, is that it just feels like he's gained this status where people are seeing what they want to see with him. And, he's going to be a short price in the Derby, even though he's coming off a 116 TimeformUS speed figure, a 95 buyer. Those aren't the kinds of numbers that the favorite in the Derby is usually running, but he's got this reputation that it just feels like he's almost guaranteed to be overbet at this point. So I do want to proceed with a little bit of caution from a wagering standpoint around this horse. I mean, it's a long way out. We still have another round of preps to be run, and for the fields to fully get set, we've got to see how those things play out. But just ahead of time, I'm kind of preparing myself to maybe downgrade Forte a little bit when I do my Derby handicapping.
Yeah, no argument with that. You know me, I'm going to look for reasons not to bet a favorite. Just a couple things before we wrap this race up. I'll say I don't think there's really much else to talk about in the field. Some of the others ran some okay figures, but nothing that's going to make them any kind of Derby contender. As to the timing, thanks to you for pointing it out. I know a lot of times I get the credit for this. This was 100% you. I had already made the speed figures, didn't notice because I didn't look at that interior fraction. So kudos to you, and it's always good when we can work together. We worked with the buyer team. I was confident in the time I had, but it's always good to get Randy Moss that were within 3/100ths on our time, so we were confident there. And for Equibase for making the quick change that they did. Um, it's a shame there's no head on. Maybe we could have seen what happened. I think that's kind of sad in this day and age that the Derby favorite, we can't view the head on of his race. I hope that's something Gulfstream can remedy. That's not something I've ever come across before for one of these races, so that's kind of bad. The timing also did a couple things. It changed the figures to red, which we didn't have before. That made total sense to me because the race looked like a kind of a meltdown. It was one that everybody was kind of falling apart that was up near the front early. So it made more sense when we did fix the time. And the other thing I brought up on Twitter is that I would explain on this show is the speed figure only regressed 2 points. And some wondered why zero point 0.9 seconds would only be 2 points. And it's because this race wasn't rated in isolation. There were 3 routes on the card. Unfortunately, one of them had a very slow pace, so that got the P designation, and it wasn't used in the variant calculation. Bigger change came in the Gulfstream Park Oaks, which we're going to talk about, and I guess it's a good segue into that. That actually looked painfully slow. It's still a pretty slow race, but that one went up. I think it was 4 points, while this one dropped two. So that kind of explains it. It worked over two races, the timing change, not just this one.
Yeah, before we get to that Gulfstream Park Oaks, Craig, I do want to respond to something that you said about the video archive of some of these derby preps. Yeah, it's disappointing there's no head on. I think the pan shot is also disappointing. I mean, I know that they were using some different camera angles for showing this, for the purposes of showing this race on NBC, the drone shot, some close-ups, but in the official pan shot that the track puts out, we shouldn't have all of those other angles that prevent you from seeing what's going on at different points in the race, heading around the clubhouse turn. We don't need a close up on the top three runners if it's at the expense of showing what was happening to horses like Forte and Mage, towards the back of the pack. For trip handicapping purposes, which is a huge part of people wagering on the game, you don't want to prevent the information from getting out there. And I think it's disappointing that there really now is no archive of what happened at certain points in the Florida Derby because the pan shot used all of these creative camera angles. If you want to use those angles on, an NBC show or like the Fox show, America's Day at the Races, they do that. That's all fine. But, at least when Naira shows those creative shots at America's Day at the Races, they just have the regular pan shot available as a separate replay. And I think other tracks need to do the same, because it's unfortunate when you can't view the entire race or see the entirety of a horse's trip in a race like the Florida Derby.
Yeah, nothing to add. You're 100% right. And the horse players need to be considered more than they are.
Well, let's move on to that slower stakes race that was run just earlier on that Saturday card at Gulfstream, the Gulfstream Park Oaks. And Craig, Affirmative Lady got the job done here. I would say she looked like maybe the only horse in this race that wanted to go the mile and a 16th distance. There were a lot of tired fillies at the end of this race, especially fourth place finisher Dorth Vader, who looked like she had the race won at the top of the stretch, but she really hit a wall when she came into that final furlong. And Affirmative Lady, I guess the one thing that we knew about her based on her performance in the Demoiselle last year was that she was going to get the distance, and she did it, not in particularly fast time, but good enough to beat this field.
Yeah, this was not a good field. As I said, the timing miscue helped the figure a little bit from a 95 up to a 99. Still not a very good race. I wouldn't totally write off the winner, Affirmative Lady, just because, as you pointed out when we did a preview of this race, she's the one horse who definitely seems to want to go longer. So maybe the mile and the eighth of the Oaks would help. Maybe she could run a little faster. The rest of them, absolutely no chance. It was a bad race. I was actually starting to congratulate myself on the turn for going with Dorth Vader in this race in our preview and had some money on her. And boy, did she hit a wall, as you say. But that said, she wasn't even the biggest disappointment of the race. Miracle, who I believe wound up going off the favorite or co-favorite, just was a complete no-show in here. Did absolutely no running at any point, and I guess you could say the same for both of the horses that took most of the money, Miracle and Atomically, who surprisingly was 2-1 as well. But for me, Miracle was the one with her resume that was just really disappointing.
Yeah, I mean, we had talked about how some of the horses out of that Rachel Alexandra at Fairgrounds hadn't necessarily run back to that number. I know you had voiced that as a concern about Miracle when we did this race on our video preview for DRF. And just like Pretty Mischievous, the winner of that race took a step backwards. Miracle took a big step backwards here. Didn't have her customary early speed and just was never really involved in this race. So, yeah, I'm not sure what kind of impact this is going to have on the Kentucky Oaks. It's not like any of the 3-year-old fillies out there are running that fast, at least none of those going 2 turns. That doesn't count the very fast sprinter, Money's Gold. But it still seems like Affirmative Lady might be a cut below even some others that would be pretty fancy moving on to the Kentucky Oaks. Let's move on to some of the turf stakes that took place at Gulfstream on Saturday. A couple of marathon races, including the Grade 2 Pan American. probably not the strongest edition of the Grade 2 Pan American that we've ever seen, as the winner of this race was the venerable New York-bred Therapist, a horse that most people would not have ever pegged as one that could get a mile and a half distance. Some people didn't even think he was particularly fond of going a mile, preferring him over sprint distances in the past. But somehow, in Mike Maker's care, Therapist can get a mile and a half. I will say, Craig, the pace of this race definitely worked in this horse's favor.
Oh, for sure. It's just, I don't know how you could come up with a source other than Mike Maker, but we've talked about him countless times over the years in these 11 and 12 furlong races. I don't know how he does it, but it works. So, I mean, there's not a whole lot I can add to it. I assume he's going to keep running this horse long. I have no idea where it came from, but the guy gets the job done. Therapist ran a 122 TimeformUS speed figure, which is, I believe, as good as he's ever run. I think he might have hit in the 120s a couple times, but it's been a while since he's a pretty old horse these days. But once again, we get a Mike Maker exacta in a grade 2 stakes race going a mile and a half.
Yeah, and I'm kind of taking that speed figure for this race with a grain of salt for a couple of reasons. There was the extremely fast pace in the early stages. I think the early leader was getting pace figures above 150. I mean, that's pretty. I don't want to say fast because it's a mile and a half race, but it's unsustainable going this distance. And it kind of fell into the lap of some of the closers. Even a horse like Masterpiece, who was the big favorite here, I don't think Jose Ortiz moved too soon because the horse just kind of inherited the lead on the far turn as the leaders were coming back. But it was the kind of race where the last move was the most successful move, and that just happened to be turned in by Therapist, who really didn't look like he was going anywhere with a half mile to go. But one by one, the horses in front of him just kept coming up empty, and he was able to inherit the lead the last at the very end. But to me, Craig, this does not feel like a race that should be rated 120 plus. It just seemed like a really weak edition of this race coming in. I thought Masterpiece did not run up to his usual standard. So I'm kind of viewing this as a race with viewing this fig with a little bit of skepticism. And beyond that, if you watch the Gulfstream Park turf races from this past weekend, I hope they're giving that turf course a rest for a while because it was in pretty bad shape. A lot of kickback, a lot of dusty kickback, just patches that had no grass growing on them. So, I mean, races that are run over courses like that, I always want to kind of just be a little bit cautious moving forward.
Yeah, I think pace did have something to do with it because I will point out this is one of the rare times that we actually had two races run at the distance of a mile and a half, and they did pretty much fit together well. So it's not just a one race number, but both of them have red fractions. Maybe the pace was part of that, but even for that, a grade 2, it's just average at best, a 122, I would say.
And actually, the version for the fillies and mares, the mile and a half Orchid, a grade 3 event, went a little bit faster than the Pan American. And that makes sense to me, Craig, because I think that the winner of this race, Amazing Grace, might actually be pretty good. A horse making her first start in this country for Christophe Clement, a mare that had previously raced in Germany and had had success in that country. She was a Group 2 winner in Germany. She had actually most recently finished third in a Group 1 behind Breeders' Cup Turf winner Rebel's Romance. So she definitely had credentials coming into this race, and she unleashed a pretty strong late rally. As you said, the pace worked in her favor, but just kind of that patented Joao Rosario ride, being very patient and getting this mare to come through when he needed her.
Yeah, there were a couple of imports for Christophe Clement running first and third. I thought they both ran pretty well. They sandwiched Personal Best, who's in really good form right now, had won a race earlier at the meet at this distance. So this was what I would consider a pretty strong race for grade 3 fillies and mares, with the winner getting a 123 figure, and I would assume she's going to move up in class next time.
Yeah, she seems like a horse that could have a pretty nice future staying in this country for the rest of the season. And Personal Best, I thought she ran well, kind of a similar situation to Masterpiece in the race we just talked about. She was moving a little bit earlier than Amazing Grace, going wide around the far turn to do it, and just couldn't really produce that extra turn of foot at the very end that Amazing Grace possessed. But I agree. I think both of the top two ran well in this race. A little bit later in the day at Gulfstream, they ran the ungraded Appleton Stakes, this one going the mile distance for the older horses. And the Todd Pletcher trained Steady On, same connections as Forte, also owned by Ripoli's stable, getting his first stakes win here. This one, a pretty lightly raced 4-year-old. He's kind of been knocking on the door at the stakes level and was able to break through here, getting a very good trip from Irad Ortiz.
He did. Irad gave his patented good ride, especially on turf in these turf routes, and was able to get the job done. It was a good speed figure from Steady On, who's running nice numbers, particularly for a lightly raced, pretty young 4-year-old. He's going to get a 121 for this effort, and I just like the progression from him. He narrowly lost to Emmanuel, another horse who is a good 4-year-old, seems to be moving in the right direction. So it seems like we have some good turf milers coming up.
Yeah, Churchtown, who was second in this race, I thought was pretty game, tried to battle back at the end, actually got a higher speed figure than Steady On. Steady On got the 121. Churchtown got a 123, finishing second in this race, so a slight pace upgrade there. So both of those put in nice efforts. Fort Washington, who was third, just continues to break slowly. That's been a problem for him, really, for his entire career, and difficult to make up that kind of ground, especially over a turf course like Gulfstream Park, when you give away so much to your rivals in the early stages. One more race to talk about from Gulfstream before we move on. That's the Sanibel Island, this one going the 7.5 furlong distance for the 3-year-old fillies. And just wanted to mention this one, Craig, because I thought the winner, Breathaway, was pretty impressive for Christophe Clement. Sure, she got some pace to close into, but the turn of foot that she unleashed through the stretch to kick away from this field was pretty devastating.
It was, and I mean, it wasn't like it was a crazy fast pace. It was these 7.5 furlong races are always tough because there's usually a pretty quick run into the first turn, and we do see a red fraction here because of that short run, and then things seem to flatten out a little bit, and that's what happened here. So I mean, it's not like she got a suicidal pace up front, and her kick in the stretch was pretty amazing. I mean, to pull away and win by 2.5 lengths the way she did was more impressive than the number will show. She got a 101 speed figure, which is fine for 3-year-old fillies this time of year, but I think she's probably a little better than that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. She just got a slightly higher speed figure than her rivals this day, but it's the kind of race that when you watch the replay, she's in a different league than those horses. Just the way that she was able to burst clear of this field at the very end. So seems like one with some talent, being by Bated Breath, that European sire who tends to get more sprinter milers. I'll be interested to see how far she wants to go. Both of her turf victories have come over the 7.5 furlong distance, but definitely one who can really close and finish through the wire. Let's move on to Oaklawn Park, and we'll, of course, begin with the Derby prep that they ran there, the Grade 1 Arkansas Derby, same 9 furlong distance as the Florida Derby, and Craig, this was a real coming out party for Angel of Empire, proving that his victory in the Risen Star from about 5 or 6 weeks ago was no fluke at all. Even though he was a big price winning that race, he came back and took yet another step forward to win here in even more commanding fashion. And I didn't think he lucked into this victory at all. He commenced a rally around the far turn with about a half mile to go. Seemed almost like he might have been moving too soon, but when they got to the top of the stretch, Flavien Prat asked him to go, and he had even more in the tank to run away from this field at the end. So definitely Angel of Empire seems like a major player heading on towards the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, he's a good one. He certainly showed that form was no fluke. He had already won at the 9 furlong distance, something new, well, not really new anymore, but last 3 or 4 years in Louisiana, and he is just a horse moving in the right direction. We had mentioned on the forecast how he is improving his speed figures every single time out. He ran a 110 win in the Risen Star. He ran a 117 here. So even just a tick faster than Forte, I'm not going to make a big deal out of a big point. What I would make a big deal out of is how he is progressing from his 2-year-old numbers and just keeps moving forward and seems like he's definitely going in the right direction.
I agree with that, Craig. You want to see these horses moving forward into a race like the Kentucky Derby. And what I also like about Angel of Empire is while he what probably is categorized as a closer. He's not one of these horses that drops way out of his races in the early going. And actually, in this Arkansas Derby, he was hanging a little bit closer to the leaders than I think some people might have expected, just kind of tacked on to that second flight of runners moving down the backstretch. And I mean, he has the kind of finishing speed that when you let him get that close to the pace, you know that he's going to be tough to hold off. And once he commenced that move, I mean, there was just going to be no stopping him. So definitely an impressive effort from Angel of Empire, who seems pretty legitimate at this stage. Certainly some disappointments among those that finished in behind Craig, particularly the third place finisher, Reincarnate, who I didn't think had a big excuse. The pace of this race was pretty moderate, and he got a good stalking trip, just sitting right off Two Eagles River, and really kind of came up empty when it mattered in the stretch.
He was. He just didn't have it. He had no excuses whatsoever. And it's not like Angel of Empire beat this field, by a length or a length and a half. He blew the field away. So for me, it's kind of hard to find excuses for anybody else in here. Reincarnate was disappointing. Rocket Chem was coming out of that second behind Forte in the Fountain of Youth. He just kind of ran the same speed figure, even a mild regression. Red Route 1, who had looked so impressive in the lane, at least in the Rebel, he kind of just was up to the same games. Even with blinkers, he dropped way far out of it, was kind of weaving in the stretch. Didn't seem like the jockey could keep him straight. So he's obviously got some work to do. And I guess that would explain why a horse who was 58-1 and King Russell was able to kind of, I don't want to say clunk up, but he really did just kind of clunk up in the second when nobody else delivered.
Yeah, and I would have to say that this result really does not flatter the Rebel winner confidence game, who has been inactive since then, and we'll see if we actually do get to preview him in a prep race before the Kentucky Derby. It sounds like they're considering trading up to the Derby with him, but those horses that took advantage of that fast pace in the Rebel did not come back to run well here at all. Reincarnate, Red Route 1, and even Bourbon Bash, who finished last year, was another one that, I mean, he was fifth in the Rebel and just did not run back to that performance at all here. So I think there has to be a little bit of concern about how strong that Rebel really was, even though it got a nice speed figure at the time. And Rocket Can, he was the metric against how you might want to measure Forte against some of these other horses that are out there, and he really didn't run too well here. Just missed getting up for third, but never really looked like he was going anywhere in the stretch. And you mentioned King Russell. I don't know where this performance came from, because he had never run this kind of speed figure before, but he followed Angel of Empire into the race around the far turn and was able to clearly get the distance, whereas some others seem to be struggling with that at the very end of the race. So to me, I'm on the same page as you. It was Angel of Empire and everybody else. So I guess horses like King Russell and Reincarnate, and I suppose Rocket Can, they're all in the Kentucky Derby field on points, but I'm not sure I want any of those that finished behind Angel of Empire in this race.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I haven't checked the points list, but it seems like we could have 3 and maybe even 4 shippers coming over. I think you might have mentioned that last week from Japan and the Europe route. So after the preps next week and even the Lexington, the field we're looking at right now with points-wise could certainly take a change, and I think a lot of these horses would be on the outside looking in.
Yeah, it seems like there are 2 confirmed runners from Japan. We're still waiting on confirmation for that horse that was successful in the European road to the Derby. The one Japanese horse that I think was second in the UAE Derby is likely not coming. So it seems like there could be just 18 spots open at the maximum to horses that are trying to get points in these races in the U.S. And the threshold is going to be much higher this year than it has been in past years. That seems basically a certainty.
Yeah, but I don't think anybody's going to be scared off by Forte as the morning line favorite. And it just seems like it's going to take a lot more points than it has in the past. Some of that's because the point system's a little different. They're giving out points differently. But still, I think there's going to be a lot more horses wanting to run this year that just aren't going to make it.
A little bit earlier in the day at Oaklawn, we saw their Kentucky Oaks prep, the Grade 3 Fantasy, this one going the mile and a 16th distance, and might have seen the Oaks favorite here, Craig, as Wet Paint basically completed her sweep of this series of stakes races at Oaklawn Park through the winter and spring as she collected her 3rd stakes victory in a row in this fantasy. And I can't say too much about the field that she was beating here because they just seem like a fairly average group. But what is apparent apparent is that wet paint is superior to them.
Yeah, there were at least some ship-ins. I know we tried to make a case for the horses that weren't all coming out of that last race. I think 7 horses in the field were coming out of Wet Paint's last win. None of the shippers in did anything. They all kind of stunk, to be honest, weren't ever competitors. So Wet Paint just keeps beating up on the same horses. She looks good doing it. I've mentioned a few times I don't think she's the kind of horse that you can judge too harshly on the speed figures, but it would be nice if she ran a fast race at some point. Now, she's not getting a lot of pace to close into. The pace was just average in this one. She certainly finishes off her races strong. She showed it wasn't just a wet track, she handled the fast track fine. But I still have some reservations because she ran a 106 here. I think her best is a 107. It's going to need to be better, I would think, for the Kentucky Oaks.
Yeah, I mean, there aren't too many fillies out there that have run faster yet, but you would imagine at some point one of these 3-year-old fillies is going to take a step forward, and maybe it'll happen in a race like the Kentucky Oaks. She's good. It's a little bit of a concern that she just lacks that early speed. She breaks with the field in her races most of the time, but she's just so sluggish after that, and she's slow to get into stride, so she has to make this last to first move, and she was able to do it here, just kind of looping the field. Flavien Prat rode her like she was much the best horse, and she was, but it's tough to do that in a race like the Kentucky Oaks. She reminds me a little bit of Kathleen O from last year, who, generated a lot of attention for her last to first wins in the prep races, but it's tough to do that in a 14-horse field or a 12-horse field, whatever we're going to get in the Kentucky Oaks. You have to deal with a lot more traffic, some better rivals, so Wet Paint, not the kind of horse that I'd want to take a short price on, but I do think that she's shown some talent in these prep races. Move on to some stakes for older horses. The Oaklawn Mile was run earlier in the day at Oaklawn on Saturday. This one, of course, going the 1 mile distance with the short stretch run. This was won by the Bob Baffert trained Hopper, who shipped in. And Craig, I imagine you want to mention these 1 mile races that were run at Oaklawn, and maybe there were some speed figure difficulties because a couple of these stakes races featured some very fast paces that I think messed with the closing splits a little bit. And Hopper definitely not finishing with the speed of a horse like Angel of Empire at the end, but they did a lot of work in the early stages.
Yeah, this is one of those cards. In fact, I want to go back and have another look. The Gulfstream timing issue kind of set me back on that, but I have this one flagged, and it's not the other races. It's the 1 mile races. I think I coded them both with the B for breakouts because the times just didn't fit with any of the other races or with each other. So I timed them, and the times are accurate. There's no problem with that. It's just one that didn't seem to fit. I couldn't rate them together, couldn't rate them with the other races. The figures would have been outlandish in either way too fast or way too slow. So I just went with the breakout for now, but it's one I will be reviewing. Hopper wound up with a 122, which just kind of fits what he's been running. What makes me a little uncomfortable about that is visually, it just did not look like that good of a race to me.
I would agree with that. It was obvious that these horses were struggling a little bit at the end of the race, and maybe that has a lot to do with how fast they went for the opening quarter and half mile. What was weird about it was that it wasn't a race that really fell apart. Hopper was attending the pace most of the way. It was really just the front runner Atoka who plummeted through the pack. I mean, I guess the horse that was disappointing in here, Craig, was Smile Happy, who seemed like the one that should have been the beneficiary of some fast early fractions, but he was kind of never in the most comfortable spot between horses towards the inside. And with that short stretch run going the 1 mile distance, when he gets out into the clear, there just isn't that much time to pick up the leaders in the stretch. I thought it was weird that Ken McPeak even ran him in this race, coming back on 2 weeks rest, turning back from 1.125 to a mile. The whole thing was kind of weird. Why not just wait for a race like the Oaklawn Handicap? I didn't get it, and maybe they're regretting it in retrospect, given the way that he ran, but just kind of an odd race overall.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to. It's not like I made money in this race. I tossed Smile Happy immediately. 2 weeks, turn back. It just made no sense. I heard him talking on the Fox show. I guess they said he doesn't like the train, so they figured they might as well run him because they can't train him. But it just made no sense in this spot for him to run. I think he'll be fine. I'd even say it's possible maybe he bounced a little bit. I mean, he was coming off of that, 10-month layoff, I guess, from the Kentucky Derby. Ran a big race first time back, no doubt. He had run a 119 speed figure. So I'm just putting a line through this race and hope he's a little better managed going forward.
The other 1 mile stakes race on this card was for the 3-year-olds. This one was won by Ian Clover. And kind of a weird race, Craig, because for such a small field, it seemed like there was a lot of pace signed on paper, and it certainly developed on the racetrack as there was a bit of a tussle for the early lead. Rocking Rocket, who finished last, he can be kind of a runoff, and he set the pace here. And again, was a pretty fast pace for the distance, at least relative to the final time. Ian Clover got kind of roughed into the first turn of that race, got a little rank. Horses were drifting about in front of him. So a weird race overall, but Ian Clover did run well to get the victory.
He did. He got a 112 speed figure. I need to go back and watch this one because I saw the news yesterday reported at DRF that Florent Geroux was actually suspended for his ride on this horse. So it seemed like he was the one when I watched it taking the worst of it. But apparently the steward saw something different. And I'm not saying that they're wrong because I need to watch it again. But he received a pretty harsh penalty for a race that didn't even feature an objection or a inquiry or anything like that. So he ran fine. Yet another in the armada of Brad Cox 3-year-olds. Not sure where he's going to show up next. Maybe that Oaklawn Invitational they run on Derby Day could be a spot. I don't even know if they run it on Derby Day anymore because I think the winner can go to the Preakness. Maybe they pushed it a week earlier. But wherever. I'm not sure where he'll show up, but he's pretty good. So he's one moving in the right direction, keeps improving his speed figures every time out. So I look forward to him as one that could be a late developer.
Yeah, and he's a horse who finished, I believe, fourth in the Gotham, but was really the only horse that survived a very fast pace that fell apart in that race. So, kind of validates that was the race flow of the Gotham, and you want to bet back the horses that were involved in that pace because he did come back to get the victory here. I'll have to go back and watch it. With regard to that news, Craig, I didn't see that story yet about Florent Geroux getting punished for this ride. Yeah, I thought the horse was kind of green when I first saw it, and maybe that others were at fault, but I'll have to go back and watch it because I don't remember exactly. I guess that the disappointment in this race would have been Gun Pilot, who was second. I mean, he was sitting behind all of that early. Seemed like he got the perfect pace set up front and still couldn't pick up Ian Clover in the stretch, so he's been a little bit of a disappointment.
Yeah, no doubt. He seems to take money every single time out and just isn't really delivering. Not sure. Uh, Maybe the mile's a little too far for him. Maybe he'd be better off sprinting it. But he's had success early. Just seems like he's a horse who's not doing well right now, as he was progressing and now just seems to have regressed the last couple times.
I've said it before, but I would like to see Gun Pilot on the turf. Maybe they'll make that move for his next start after he was a little disappointing here. Another race that we should mention from Saturday at Oaklawn was a maiden special weight event that took place much earlier in the day. This one going the 6 furlong distance, and it was won by the first-time starter Federal Judge, a 3-year-old that beat some more experienced rivals, including some 4-year-olds in the field. And Craig, for this horse to win by the margin that he did over some horses that had already run some nice speed figures in their careers, points this one out as a horse that could have some real talent, and the 112 TimeformUS speed figure certainly corroborates that notion.
Yeah, that was a good effort by him. He was fast out of the gate, just looked really professional all the way around, and just kept moving further and further away from the field as the went on. And as you say, it's not like he beat a bunch of slouches in here. There were horses who have run in the 90s. The runner-up have run in the hundreds a couple times. So that 112 seems totally legit. And Rudolph Brissett, he's not one that's always known for having first-time starters be this ready. So this one's clearly got some talent.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see where this horse goes. This is not a barn that I always think of as developing horses from first time starters to reaching their apex in stakes races. So we'll see which direction he goes from here. But definitely an impressive unveiling. And as far as pedigree goes, I couldn't find a whole lot to really highlight. There's not a lot of production on the dam side, even going back to the second generation. He is by Distorted Humor out of a Congaree dam. You don't often see Congaree in the pedigree these days, but definitely some brilliance there with that cross, and it definitely came through in this horse. Move on to a stakes race from Friday at Oaklawn. That was the Matron run over a wet track. This one going the 6 furlong distance for fillies and mares. Pretty small field, but a lot of speed in this race for a small field, as that very fast Norm Cassie horse, Pretty Birdie, sped off to an extremely fast opening quarter, which set it up for the two horses that were sitting back off of that, and they're two pretty nice horses, Wicked Halo and Matarea, who inherited and went on to finished first and second in this race, and this came up a pretty fast one, Craig.
There were plenty 6 furlong races on the card. The track was pretty consistent. I will say I think the pace probably inflated the speed figure a little bit. In addition to the small pace adjustment the top two finishers got because of that fast early pace. I just think when it gets that fast, if you have talented horses, it's going to bring out their absolute best. I mean, Wicked Halo's a really good filly. We saw her last year. She was third in the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint. Did that. I think it was second off a lay or second or third off a layoff. I can't remember, but she was pretty good last year, and she seems to be one moving in the right direction. She wound up with a 124 here, and Matarea was another who had showed a lot of promise as a 3-year-old. So the sprinting filly and mare sprinting division's looking pretty good, unlike it has in a couple years past. I think I saw Goodnight Olive is getting ready to make her return soon. She was obviously the champion last year and the one horse who had run some pretty fast speed figures toward the end of the season.
Yeah, these are both horses that had shown a lot of talent, as you perfectly summed up there. It is the kind of speed figure that seems so fast. You wonder if maybe it's a race that you could have broken out. Looking at the buyer number, I think that's probably what they did, because they had it much slower. And as you said, it's just a fast race on the day, so you'd have to do that if you were going to give it a lower number. They are 4-year-old fillies, so it's possible they're just stepping forward as they mature. I'll be interested to see if these horses can continue to earn numbers like this throughout the season, because they definitely have run well. I should say they ran well in this race and have shown talent before. One more race from Oaklawn that I want to mention from last week. It was a Thursday allowance race going the 1 mile distance for the 3-year-olds. And Echo again finally got back to the winner's circle. This was that Steve Asmussen runner that looked so impressive when he won his debut sprinting at Saratoga last year. Wasn't successful on the Kentucky Derby Trail, but they lowered their sights a little bit here, running in this allowance race and able to get back to the winner's circle. I'm still not convinced that this horse really wants to go 2 turns, Craig, but he was able to get the victory here.
Yeah, even though he won, the speed figure would probably kind of indicate that. He only ran a 108 speed figure here. He's run fast. He ran faster in his debut sprinting. Um, he did win around 2 turns, and it's not in the PPs, but he probably would have 2 wins around 2 turns. There was a race that had to be canceled in the stretch because of a bad spill, a race he was obviously going to win. But again, that was in a lesser class company, and against better horses, I just don't think he wants to go long. And I do think his future should be sprinting, but I guess when you have a horse that has this much talent, you don't want to give up on him. Particularly, he has the breeding, it seems like, one that should be able to go long, and there's better money going long, but I'm in your camp. I'd rather see him around 1 turn.
The really perplexing part of this race to me was Tyler's Tribe trying to go a mile. I mean, this is a horse that they've tried some weird things with. He's never struck me as one that wants to go a step beyond 6 furlongs, so I thought this was a really weird spot, especially for a horse that has had bleeding issues in the past, to try to make him go a mile. I think that horse could be managed a little bit better.
Yeah, no argument from me. Yeah, I know he was a favorite of a lot of people, including ours. He was running fast races. It hasn't been so great since the Breeders' Cup when they tried him on turf and he bled bad. He bled next time. I haven't heard if he did this time, but Going a mile, I don't know. Sometimes it's easier on front runners because they get to relax on the front end, but he doesn't seem like the kind of horse to me that's going to relax. He's just really fast and should probably be sprinting.
Move on to Aqueduct. Their feature race there on Saturday was the Excelsior, going the mile and an eighth distance for the older horses. And Craig, Law Professor is a horse that has been doing some pretty good work at Aqueduct. He was that pretty strong second to Life is Good in the Woodward at the Belmont at the Big A meet last year. That was also run over a wet track, and he won the Queens County over the winter. And tried a race at Oaklawn that was probably too tough for him, but back at Aqueduct here, he registered another 120 plus TimeformUS speed figure.
Yeah, he gets a 125 here. The final time was a 123. So that shows you the pace was pretty quick, which is no surprise. We saw a sub 47 for the half mile. So quick race. I think he's probably a little better than what he showed at Oaklawn. I don't think he ran his A race that day. The competition was definitely better in that race, but I still think he's one I wouldn't write off as a listed stakes grade 3, particularly in a year like this where the older horse division looks pretty weak.
Yeah, I was a little concerned he might not be running his race in the early stages because he was a little keen. He had trouble settling into the first turn, but once he got into the rhythm on the backstretch, it was pretty clear that he was going to pull away from this field, and that's what happened. 125 TimeformUS speed figure, pretty strong for this listed stakes race won by Law Professor.
Yeah, and I said we should probably mention the two horses that finished in front of him at Oaklawn could very well be the two best older horses in training right now.
Yes, Last Samurai and West Willpower, both very good. I kind of wonder if we'll see them match up in the Oaklawn Handicap next. That would be something to see. Definitely beaten by two better horses in that prior race. Another race that I want to mention from this past week at Aqueduct was a Friday maiden special weight for the 3-year-old fillies. And Craig, we've talked quite a bit about how the 3-year-old fillies on the Kentucky Oaks Trail are not earning very impressive speed figures. Well, we saw a pretty fast performance from the Chad Brown second-time starter randomized, breaking her maiden in this race, coming off a long layoff. We'd only seen her once before at Saratoga last summer when she had finished third behind the impressive debut winner Kaling, who came back to be third in the spinaway. We've also seen some nice runners come out of that race that finished behind her, and Randomized clearly relished the stretch out in distance and benefited from the time away because 113 TimeformUS speed figure, that's strong for a 3-year-old filly.
Yeah, she looked very good doing it. I mean, she made the lead early. She was pressured by Gifted, who was actually the favorite in here. It's not like she was some long shot. Held on for second and just blew the field away in the stretch. I mean, she was drawing away from Gifted, and even more so than that, Gifted was drawing away from everybody else. So it wasn't the strongest field outside the top two, but just a really good effort from Randomize, and the future is bright, particularly when you consider that 113 speed figure, which would if it was done in a Oaks Point race, she'd be one of the favorites. I'm not suggesting that's where she should go. She obviously couldn't get in probably, and she's still very lightly raced, but there's a lot of talent with her.
Yes, it is late in the year for her to make a race like that, but there are plenty of big races in the summer for her, grade ones at Saratoga that I'm sure they'll be thinking about with a horse like this after this performance. We'll see what Chad Brown decides to do with her, if they target an allowance race first or move right into stakes company, but she certainly seems like one that would fit pretty nicely among the best of the 3-year-old crop right now. Let's move on to Santa Anita, where we're going to talk about another 3-year-old performance, but a male horse and one that's actually competing on the turf. That's the winner of Sunday's Pasadena Stakes, Johannes, a Tim Yakteen trainee. And Greg, it looks like Tim Yakteen might have the best 3-year-old dirt horses and the best 3-year-old turf horse in California right now, as Johannes has really just turned the corner since he's been switched over to the grass.
Yeah, I know we tend to downplay the Southern California turf season for good reason. Normally, it's a little below what we see other jurisdictions, but I don't think Johannes is one of them. He is good. He's a horse who first try on turf broke his maiden with a 111. He then tried a stakes race, had all kind of trouble. I thought was still able to win even though his speed figure regressed to a 99. He stretched out here, and I don't have the official number for him. He's the only one on the show that I'm not going to have one. But there were 4-mile turf races at Santa Anita on Sunday, so it looks like a pretty easy speed figure to me. And I get it at roughly about a 112. I would be surprised if it's much different from that when my assistant sends it in later today. So, really good effort from him. Handled the extra distance easy. I would even argue that it seemed like he liked going longer more than sprinting.
Yeah, I agree. His performance in that Baffle Stakes was much better than the length and a quarter margin of victory suggests. That's if you can go back and watch that replay, it was an amazing ride by Umberto Rispoli, who got this horse out of some traffic, and he split horses with amazing finishing speed to get the victory that day. And different kind of style here, much better trip as he was just able to loop the field, small field, just facing three rivals. But as you said, the way that he finished off this race, going the mile distance for the first time, was pretty impressive. And I mean, the way that this son of Nyquist strides over the turf, it's just completely different than his dirt races early in his career. He's really taken to this surface, and we've got some talented 3-year-old turf horses out there. I mean, we've talked about that duo that's untested in stakes so far, Carl Spackler and Far Bridge. Talk of the Nation, who was so impressive winning that stakes at Tampa a few weeks ago. The Todd Pletcher horse, Major Dude, who was second in the Jeff Ruby Stakes, and now Johannes out in California. It could be fun to watch these horses if they're able to match up over the summer.
Yeah, no doubt. It's not often I'm looking forward to the 3-year-old turf division, but this is definitely a year I am because we have a group that is faster than normal for sure.
And we also saw a nice 3-year-old performance on Saturday at Santa Anita in a maiden special weight race. The very expensive and well-named Ultimate Gamble, who was purchased as a 2-year-old for $1.75 million, makes the second start of his career a winning one, coming off a long layoff for Mark Glatt. And Craig seemed like he handled the added distance without much trouble.
Yeah, he did. He ran a nice race. He was coming out of that Cave Rock and Practical Move maiden race, who were obviously two extremely talented 3-year-olds. And Ultimate Gamble handled this test just fine. He's going to get a 107 speed figure. That one is official. I got the Saturday work done today. And yeah, very good effort by him. He's one that has some talent, and be interesting to see if they take their time with him or move him right in the stakes. It seems like he may need a little more time to mature, but he's obviously has some ability.
Yeah, this one, nice pedigree in addition to having that strong sales work. By Medaglia d'Oro, he is a half-brother to Breeders' Cup Sprint winner Drefong, who has been a good sire in Japan, actually the sire of a horse that we're going to see in the Kentucky Derby, Continuar. So Ultimate Gamble definitely has some pedigree behind him, and now he's got that victory under his belt. So I agree, it's going to be interesting to see where he goes in the future. One more performance to talk about on this week's TimeformUS Pacecast, and we're going to go to Laurel Park to check out a race that some people might have missed in all of the major racing that was taking place this week, and that was a Friday allowance race in Maryland, won by Prove Right, a horse for trainer James Chapman, who is pretty experienced. I believe this was the 14th start of his career already, but Craig, he earned a pretty strong 115 TimeformUS speed figure for the 6 furlong allowance victory.
Yeah, I'm not sure where this race came from. I haven't went back to watch him, but the speed figure makes total sense. I mean, he blew the field away. It was a field behind him who was pretty consistent. The one thing that jumps out at me is the bright red color coding saying the track was biased. I haven't watched it yet, but there certainly did seem to be a whole bunch of wire-to-wire winners and horses who were up close all the way. So maybe that had something to do with it, but it was a big number and one we hadn't seen from him before. I think he had only hit the triple digits one time.
Yeah, I mean, he won by quite a margin, so the number kind of makes sense compared to the rest of the field, but it does seem like a bit of an outlier in his past performances, so we'll have to see if he can back it up. He certainly has had the experience under his belt to achieve something like this eventually, but you do kind of get surprised when horses suddenly jump up like this after, 10, 12, 14 starts in their careers. I guess a race like the Chick Lang on Preakness weekend could be a goal for him, that 3-year-old stakes race going 6 furlongs, because a lot of the horses that would be pointing towards that, I don't know if they've run speed figures that are quite this fast as of yet, so we'll have to see how some stakes come up that he might participate in the future.
Yeah, the one thing in addition to the bias, as you were talking, I was kind of scrolling through the charts, is it seemed like every winner on the card, save one, just completely ran away from the field and there were big margins. So it just seems like maybe there was something a little weird going on with that track. It's something maybe I'll have to ask Dan Illman about. I know he's a big Laurel guy.
Yeah, that could be. It's often a red flag when you see some lopsided victories like that when races might not necessarily look that way on paper. Well, Craig, we finished up discussing a weekend of Derby preps, and we've got another one coming at us this weekend, probably an even busier one, as we've got those 3 100-point preps on Saturday, the Grade 1 Bluegrass, the Grade 2 Wood Memorial, and actually the Bluegrass might be a Grade 2 these days. It's hard to keep track of these gradings, and the Grade 1 Santa Anita Derby, all of those 100-point preps. I don't think we've decided yet where we're going to go for the forecast. We'll kind of see how those cards come up, which sequences look appealing to us, but I'm definitely looking forward to seeing how this final round of preps shake out, because after this weekend, we should basically know who's going to be in the Kentucky Derby field.
Well, this is going to be a fun weekend. This is one of my favorite days of the whole year, this Saturday with the 3 big preps. I know we had a couple last week, but it's just 3 is better than 2. So it's just going to be a Saturday where I'm glued to the computer, glued to the TV watching. None of the cards have drawn yet, and I'm sure that'll influence not just the race, but the surrounding card as to what we'll do for the forecast. But whichever one it is, I'm sure it's going to be a good show.
Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up later in the week.